I promise I'm back. Good evening once again. Welcome to today's tutorial where we are going to be focusing about the beauty of the brainstem. But before that, please, if you have not yet subscribed, please do so and make sure you turn on the notification bell so that whenever I load a video, you become the very first person to watch it. So let's go and get started and look at what we call the brainstem. Okay. What is the brainstem generally? The brainstem is going to be one of the divisions of what we call the central nervous system. It's part of the central nervous system because it's going to be consisting of what we call the hindbrain, and then it's going to be consisting of what we call the midbrain. So let's go ahead and get started and see what makes up what we call the brainstem. So now, as you see, this structure which you are seeing here, it is showing you the brainstem, but it has also a very small portion that's going to be part of what we call the diencephalon, okay? But I'm going to be mainly focusing on what we call the brainstem. So we need to ask ourselves, what are those parts that make up the brainstem? Mainly, there are three parts that make up the brainstem. The first one, if you see the whole of this structure here, it makes up what we call the brainstem. It has this first part here, which you are seeing, which is in blue. It has this part here, which is in red, and then it has this part here, which is going to be in what we call the green color. So now we need to first understand how these parts are going to be, how they are named, okay? Now, when you see this part here is what we call the midbrain. Okay, is what we call the midbrain. Okay, and then just slightly below the midbrain, this structure here is what we call the pons. Okay, and then lastly, the one which is down here is what we call the medulla. Oblongata. Okay, is what we call the medulla oblongata. So mainly there are three parts there which are going to be making what we call the brainstem. The first one is the midbrain, and the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. So now we need to first understand where are some of these parts located. Now, anatomically, when you see at the midbrain, okay, when you say the midbrain, you see the whole of these bundles of axon, these myelinated bundles. You see the whole of these bundles. These ones are what we call the cerebral peduncles. Okay, they are what we call the cerebral peduncles, and they are going to be connecting the midbrain to the cerebrum up, which is going to be part of what we call the forebrain. So now, if we extract the whole of this midbrain, we are going to be seeing a lot of different structures, okay? Like if we extract it anteriorly, we are going to be seeing some of what we call the crus cerebri, and which are going to be now demarcated by what we call the substantia nigra, having a lot of structures like the tegmentum, and then other structures like the cerebral aqueduct, and then also the tectum. Okay, I will not go into the detail of that, but we shall later cut the whole section of the midbrain. We zoom inside and see what are those structures located inside. Okay, but for now, I want you to know that these structures you are seeing here, these bundles of the axon, they are what we call the cerebral peduncles. We have the right side and then also the left side. They are going to be helping in the up and down movement of different tracts. Okay, they are the ascending and then the descending tracts, which are going to be moving different informations down into the spinal cord. Okay. Now, coming into what we call this kind of structure here. This structure here is what we call the pons, okay? And of course, the pons is going to be located between the midbrain and then what we call the medulla oblongata. Later, we shall understand what the word pons mean. But in Latin words, it means a bridge. We shall see what we mean when we say pons acting as a bridge. But what I want you to know is that it is going to be having what we call the cerebellar peduncles, which are going to be connecting to the cerebellum. Okay, so now they are connecting to the cerebellum in a bridge way. So now that's why the pons are also called the bridge. Okay, it is bridging or connecting between the two hemispheres of what we call the cerebellum. Okay. And then when we come to the medulla oblongata is a very sweet structure which is going to be located between the pons and then down transitioning into what we call the spinal cord. So now that structure of the brainstem located between the pons and then the spinal cord is what we call the medulla oblongata. These structures, they play a very, very, very important role, as we shall see later, okay? Now, when you see this kind of depression, which is going to be located in between what we call the cerebral peduncles, how do we call this kind of small depression which is going to be inside here? This one is what we call interpeduncular fossa, and this area is going to be one of the areas which are going to be providing the exit of one of the cranial nerves, and that's cranial nerve number 3, which is the oculomotor. And then of course you're going to be seeing some of these tiny structures from a very certain kind of view, like the mammillary bodies. Also going to be seen like here, and even at the back there we're going to be seeing part of what we call the hypothalamus, okay? And also you're going to be seeing some of that leading structure, that leading tract that's going to be connecting to the hypothalamus, actually to the pituitary gland, which we call the infundibulum, okay? So you're going to be seeing a very kind of tract which is going to be leading into the pituitary gland, which we call the infundibulum, okay? So now, having looked at now these structures here, you see that these structures here which are just above of the midbrain, which are going to be part of the diencephalon. How do we call these structures? They call these structures as the thalamus, okay? They are called the thalamus, and if you remember very well, the kind of fluid-filled cavity located between the thalami, we said is called the third ventricle, okay? It's such a very beautiful structure housing a fluid-filled cavity, which is the third ventricle, okay? Now, having seen all this, let's briefly look at some of the functions which are going to be played by what we call the different parts of what we call the brainstem. The brainstem, generally it plays a very, 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 very many roles. We cannot finish them now, but we are going to be talking a few of them, okay? First of all, what I want you to know that we are going to be having what we call regulation of the following. For example, heart rate, okay? What we call heart rate. And of course, heart rate is going to be regulated by a specific part of the brainstem, which you call the medulla oblongata. And if you regulate the heart rate, it means you have the ability to regulate what we call the blood pressure, okay? The blood pressure can also be regulated by what we call the medulla oblongata. Then we also have what we call regulation of what we call breathing, okay? What we call the breathing. So now breathing is going to be part of the medulla oblongata, and then also a small portion of what we call the pons. That's where we are going to be having the respiratory centers that regulate the breathing mechanisms, okay? And then also we are going to be having a lot of protective reflexes being controlled by what we call the brainstem. So we are going to be seeing some of what we call protective reflexes. Okay, so what are some of those protective reflexes that are going to be under the control of what we call the brainstem? We have a variety of them. We have what we call the swallowing. Remember, with the swallowing, the moment food particle reaches what we call the oral pharynx, okay, we do not have control over them. Because when we say of a reflex is that automated, rapid, involuntary response to the stimulus, okay? Automated, rapid, involuntary response to a stimulus, meaning that we do not have control some of these reflexes. We do not have control over them. They are out of our conscious levels. So now, swallowing, when the food particle reaches the oral pharynx, we do not have control over it, okay? So also swallowing reflex happens immediately. Then we also have another reflex which we call the cough, okay? What we call the cough reflex. And of course, with the cough reflex is that any kind of fluid substance or any particle that falls into the air tract automatically induces a cough reflex, and this is a protective. It is a protective reflex aiming at removing those dangerous substances that enter the respiratory tract, because we only need the entry of air. Okay. We also have what we call gag reflex. Okay, we also have what we call gag reflex. What's gag reflex? Gag reflex is that reflex that if you try to insert the finger at the floor of the tongue, there is a way you feel like you want to vomit back. Okay, so now if you slightly touch at the third floor of the tongue, you will feel like you want to vomit back, and that was what we call the gag reflex. Okay, we also have another reflex which we call the vomiting. We also have what we call the vomiting reflex. Okay, so now these are some of the protective reflexes which are going to be under what we call the brainstem. Okay, now the brainstem is going to be controlling a lot of activities. Why am I saying this? We have a lot of the nuclei which are going to be located in the brainstem. So let's have a look at the different nuclei and see those kind of exit type of cranial nerves that are going to be exiting from the brainstem in just a blink of an eye. Okay. So now we need to look at a specific part of the brainstem, and we see the type of the nuclei and also the cranial nerves that are going to be exiting exactly from that part of the brainstem. So now we are going to be starting with this part of the brainstem, which we are calling the midbrain. Okay, so now we need to see what are some of those nuclei which are going to be residing in what we call the midbrain, and then also the cranial nerves which are going to be exiting from what we call the midbrain. But what I need you to know is that the midbrain or the brainstem is going to be housing 10 cranial nerve nuclei. Okay, we only have 10 cranial nerve nuclei which are going to be exiting from the brainstem, but we have a total of 12 cranial nerves which are going to be part of the peripheral nervous system. But we do not have all of these cranial nerves coming from what we call the brainstem. We have some of them which are coming from what we call the cerebrum. They are not directly related or connected to what we call the brainstem, and that's the cranial nerve number 1 and cranial nerve number 2, which is going to be olfactory and then optic. But the rest from cranial nerve number 3 up to 12, they're all going to be coming out from what we call the brainstem. So let's have a look at them individually and see on which part of the brainstem do they come out. Okay. Now, when you see the brainstem, okay, so now if I can first draw a very simple lateral view of the brainstem, including the cerebrum, we are going to be having a structure like this. Okay, you're going to be having a structure like this. It's going to be now our midbrain. This is going to be now our pons, and then the medulla oblongata. Okay, and of course, it's going to be transitioning with the spinal cord, and then behind here we are going to be having what we call the cerebellum. Okay, so now if I bring it in a very lateral view, or what we call the sagittal view, and looking it at the side, these are the areas you're going to be seeing. So now this point here is this structure you are seeing here, which we call the midbrain. Okay, and then the whole of this structure here you are seeing here, this one is what we call the pons. It is equivalent to this structure here. And then lastly, this bulbar structure, which we call the medulla, which is going to be this last part here. And of course, now the medulla oblongata is going to be transitioning to this structure, which we call the spinal cord. Okay. So now looking it on the lateral view, or what we call the sagittal view, this is how we are going to be seeing it. But of course, up here we're going to be having now what we call the forebrain, which is going to be having what we call the cerebrum, which qualifies to be the biggest part of the brain. Okay, so that is just a lateral view, or what we call the sagittal view of this brainstem. Okay. Now, primarily, we are going to be having a total of 2 nuclei of 2 cranial nerves, which are going to be coming from the brainstem. We are going to be having what we call, the first one is going to be cranial nerve number 3, and this is what we call oculomotor. what we call oculomotor nerve. Okay, oculomotor nerve. So this nerve is going to be coming, in front. Okay, it's going to be coming out and pass in front from its nucleus, which is going to be residing in the upper part, which is going to be in line with one of the kind of the dilatation structures at the back, which we call the superior curricula. Okay, so now it's going to be coming in line at the level of the superior curricula. And then the second one, which you're going to be having from the midbrain, is going to be the cranial nerve number 4. And cranial nerve number 4 is going to be what we call the trochlea. And the trochlea is one of the exceptional cranial nerves which exits at the back. Okay, it exits at the back of the midbrain, and then it passes and comes back and front. All of them of the cranial nerves are going to be coming direct into the front part, but this kind of the trochlea is going to be first passing behind the brainstem, and then comes in front. It's going to be coming at the level of what we call the inferior curricula. Okay. Now, when we talk of the inferior and superior curricula, when you see the brainstem, if I can draw this, be the midbrain, then the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. So now, when you come to the midbrain, you're going to be having these kind of two dilated structures. Okay, these kind of two dilated structures, you're going to be having, this is going to be the superior curricula, which is going to be playing more part of what we call the visual reflexes, and then the inferior curricula, which does more of what we call the auditory reflexes. Okay, and then this, it means the nuclei for the cranial nerve number 3 is going to be in line with what we call the superior curricula, and then we're going to be having a nuclei for the fourth cranial nerves, which comes out and then it comes into from the back and then goes back into the front, which is going to be the cranial nerve number 4, which is the trochlea nerve. Okay, and of course, all these cranial nerves are going to be playing a role in what we call movement of the eye, or what we call eye rotations. Okay, so now these are going to be the only cranial nerves which are going to be coming from what we call the midbrain. Okay, so now let's have a look and see the cranial nerves which are going to be exiting from what we call the pons. Okay, so now this one here is going to be now our pons. Let's have a look and see some of the nuclei which are going to be housed in what we call the pons and give us the cranial nerves. Okay, so now we are going to be having cranial nerve number. We are going to be having cranial nerve number 5, and of course, cranial nerve number 5 is what we call trigeminal nerve. Okay, trigeminal nerve. We shall see later and cut out the single trigeminal nerve and look at it critically. We shall later realize that this kind of nerve is going to be having three branches. It's going to be having the ophthalmic, the maxillary, and then it's going to be having V1, it's going to be having V2, and then V3, which is going to be now the ophthalmic, the maxillary, and then the mandibular branch of the what we call the trigeminal nerve. We shall look at that one later into the detail. Okay, so again, in the pons, you're going to be having cranial nerve number 6. Okay, and of course, cranial nerve number 6 is what we call abducens. Okay, cranial nerve number 6 is what we call the abducens. We are also going to be having cranial nerve number 7 coming from the pons, which we call the facial nerve. And then also we shall have cranial nerve number 8 coming also from the pons, which we call vestibulocochlear nerve. And of course, this vestibulocochlear nerve, you also call it the auditory nerve, is going to be responsible for what we call the hearing and what we call balance or equilibrium. Okay, so now these are going to be the cranial nerves which are going to be coming from what we call the pons. Okay, so now let's briefly have a look at what are some of those cranial nerves which are going to be coming from what we call the medulla. Okay, what we call the medulla. Okay, we also have a lot of cranial nerve nuclei which are going to be coming from what we call the medulla. So we are going to be having the following. We are going to be having cranial nerve number. We are going to be having cranial nerve number 9. Cranial nerve number 9, and of course, cranial nerve number 9 is going to be is going to be glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, its nuclei is going to be housed in what we call the medulla oblongata. We also have another cranial nerve which is called cranial nerve number 10, and this one is a very, very, very important guy called the vagus nerve. Okay, it's called the vagus nerve, and it's called the vagus because this term vagus comes in a way that it is something that moves in a very far areas. You realize that this vagus nerve is going to be moving in very many areas of the body. Okay, so the term comes on what we call the vagus nerve. So we also have another cranial nerve coming from what we call the medulla, which we call cranial nerve number 11, and this is what we call accessory nerve. And then finally, our cranial nerve number 12, which we call the hypoglossal nerve. So now these are going to be now the cranial nerves, which are going to be having their nuclei residing in the brainstem. What is the nucleus generally? A nucleus is going to be a group of neuron cell bodies located within the central nervous system. I want to repeat on this. A collection of neuron cell bodies residing into the brain and then the spinal cord is called a nucleus. But again, if we have a group of the neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system, that one becomes what we call a ganglia. Okay? These two terms should be differentiated because you're going to be using most of the time. The nucleus, a group of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system. And then a ganglia, a group or a collection of neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system, and then generally into the peripheral nervous system. Those two terms should not be confused. We're going to be using them several times. Okay? Now, having looked at now the different cranial nerves and those areas where they are coming out from on different parts of what we call the brain stem. Now, let's look and see there's some kind of the parasympathetic outflow, which is going to be coming on what we call the brain stem. So, you know, the parasympathetic outflow, we call it craniosacral outflow. Okay, we have those parasympathetic fibers which are going to be coming from the brainstem, and then also have those which are going to be coming from the sacral region. Now, those ones which are going to be coming from the cranial section, they are going to be exiting from what we call the brainstem. Okay, so let's have a look and see some of those parasympathetic outflow from the brainstem. Okay, what we call the parasympathetic outflow from the brainstem. Okay, so these are the nucleus or group of neuron cell bodies which are going to be residing inside the brainstem, and they give out the presympathetic fibers that are going to be running all the way into the different structures of the body, leading into different kind of functioning. Okay. The first one which I want you to know is what we call ending wastful nucleus. Okay. Now this ending wastful nucleus is going to be part of what we call the midbrain. Okay, it's going to be part of the midbrain. And this nucleus, the parasympathetic fibers which are going to be coming from this kind of the nucleus, they are going to be moving with what we call the cranial nerve number 3. Okay, they are going to be moving along with the cranial nerve number 3. Okay, so now the parasympathetic fibers which are going to be leaving from this ending wastful nucleus through what we call cranial nerve number 3. The parasympathetic fibers are going to be moving, and then they are going to be synapsing, or are going to be terminating in what we call the ciliary ganglion. And then of course we shall have now the post-side fibers, which are going to be coming from what we call the ciliary ganglion. They're going to go now and start innervating different structures. And mainly they're going to be innervating structures which you call, they're going to be innervating the ciliary muscles of the eyes, which are going to be aiding what we call accommodation, pupil constriction, and all that. Okay, so now these kind of fibers which are going to be leaving the ending our small nucleus through the cranial nerve number 3 are going to be aiding in pupil constriction and also regulating what we call accommodation. We also have another kind of nucleus which is going to be residing in what we call the brainstem, and this nucleus is what we call superior salivatory nucleus. Okay, and of course superior salivatory nucleus is going to be part of what we call the pons. Okay, it's going to be part of what we call the pons. Okay, so now the parasympathetic fibers which are going to be moving from this kind of nucleus, they are going to be moving along with the cranial nerve number. They are going to be moving along with the cranial nerve number 7. Okay, and that is what we call the facial nerve. So now these kind of parasympathetic fibers which are going to be leaving in the superior salivatory nucleus through what we call the cranial nerve number 7, which is going to be the facial nerve, they are going to be moving and then they're going to be now terminating in what we call the pterygopalatine ganglion, and then from there the post fibers are going to be leaving and then they go to different structures like actually it's going to be the sublingual and then the submandibular salivary glands, and then of course going to be leading into what we call salivation process, and also these fibers, some of them are going to go into the lacrimal glands, and of course it will lead into what we call lacrimation process. Okay, so now this is also one of the beautiful things which we need to know very well. Okay, and then another third nucleus which is very important, the brainstem, is what we call the inferior salivatory nucleus. Okay, and then of course the parasympathetic fibers which are going to be leaving this nucleus are going to be moving with what we call cranial nerve number 9, and of course cranial nerve number 9 is going to be now our glossopharyngeal. Okay, and it is going to be moving and then terminates into the prefibers are going to be moving and then they terminate in what we call the otic ganglion. And we said a ganglia or the ganglion, a collection of neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system. Okay, so that's why these fibers are leaving the central nervous system and they go and they synapse into a ganglia which we are calling the otic. This one here we call it the otic ganglion. Okay, the otic ganglion. And then of course for the case of the salivatory superior nucleus, these fibers are going to go and they synapse in what we call the pterygopalatine. And of course we said for the case of the endiga-wastful nucleus, it is going to be the ciliary ganglion. Okay, and then we have also the fourth nucleus which is super very important, and this nucleus is what we call the dorsal vagus nucleus. Okay, this is what we call the dorsal vagus nucleus. This one is going to be a very super nucleus, and it's going to be running, the fibers are going to be running with what we call cranial nerve number 10. Okay, and cranial nerve number 10 is what we call the vagus nerve. So now these fibers are going to be running with what we call the vagus nerve, and they are going to be moving all over the body parts. They are going to be moving in areas like for example, they're going to be supplying what we call the CVS. They're going to be supplying what we call the GI. Okay, it's such a beautiful thing. Okay, having seen all that, we shall later come and extract this brainstem, and we look individually and see where exactly these cranial nerves are going to be coming out exactly. Okay, the next video you're going to be focusing on the different cranial nerves and where they're going to be exiting from. Okay, so this comes into the end of today's tutorial, where we have covered a very little of the anatomy of the brainstem and some of the little physiologies. But later we shall come with the really detailed structure of the brainstem, showing all the different cranial nerves where they come out from. Okay, thank you very much for listening to TUMNAD as always. Until we meet next time.